A young girl playing in her yard in Spokane, Washington, suddenly vanishes. In St. Louis, another girl leaves to visit a friend. She never arrives. Horrified parents worry their children have been abducted, or worse. When children go missing without a trace, detectives must use knowledge, experience, and science to find them and apprehend those who intend to harm them. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. In Spokane, Washington, it's usually the sounds of nature that greet residents each morning. But on the morning of October 18th, 1999, one neighborhood was awakened by the voice of 33-year-old Brad Jackson.
Valerie? Valerie? Valerie?
He was frantically calling out the name of his 9-year-old daughter, Valerie.
Valerie? Valerie?
The distraught father knocked on neighbors' doors, desperate to know if anyone had seen his daughter.
Valerie? Did you see my daughter? You Valerie? Valerie? Valerie?
At 8:44, he called 911 to report Valerie missing.
Daughter's missing. How long has she been gone? Can I have your name, sir?
Within moments, deputies from the Spokane County Sheriff's Department responded to the call. Jackson told them that he had last seen Valerie playing in the yard at about 8:15.
Still here.
Several minutes later, when he came outside to walk her to school, Valerie's backpack was on the porch, but she was nowhere to be found.
She's gone. Is there anybody else she's authorized to go with? Another adult or a relative?
No.
Okay, stand by. We're going to get some more officers out here. Okay?
Sheriff's deputies and neighbors began searching the area in hopes that Valerie had decided to walk to school on her own or went to a friend's house.
Valerie!
Once those possibilities were investigated and ruled out, the search effort grew more intensive. A canine unit was called to the scene. Handlers scented the dogs with one of Valerie's shirts.
Yeah, what was the circumstance?
But their tracking turned up nothing.
She was out playing in the yard and
Valerie!
Spokane County Sheriff's Detective Dave Madsen was on the scene.
Anytime a child disappears, searching the residence for anything is very important to see if there's any evidence of foul play at the scene itself.
Has anybody noticed anything out of the ordinary this morning?
In this case, the residence belonged not to Brad Jackson, but to his parents, Dick and Karen Jackson.
Brad and Valerie had been living with Karen and Dick, his parents, for about 7 months.
well, we moved in here because my girlfriend doesn't get along
Jackson,
with Valerie.
a single father with sole custody of Valerie, explained that he and his daughter had previously been living at his girlfriend's home.
Just so you stay.
They moved back in with his parents because the girlfriend did not get along with Valerie.
When was the last time you saw her this morning?
Valerie's mother had not been seen by anyone in the family for several years. Madsen questioned Jackson and his parents about when they last saw Valerie. His father, Dick, said he saw her the prior evening.
Before I leave and make sure that she's covered up and warm.
Before she went to bed, we talked and hugged, and she asked me if I was going to work. I worked in Portland. She asked me if I was leaving in the morning, and she asked when she would see me again, And I told her the following week, but that was the last time I seen her.
Jackson's mother, Karen, had seen Valerie at about 4:30 on the morning of her disappearance.
Usually before I left for work, I'd go in and always make sure, you know, give her a little hug and kiss, which I did, and then I left for work.
I found out she was gone.
Brad Jackson told police again that he had seen Valerie playing in the yard before school,
Her backpack outside.
but about 15 minutes later, she was gone.
I mean, she has a long time.
Would it be okay if we took a look in Valerie's room?
Sure.
The Jacksons gave investigators permission to look around the house for anything that might explain what happened to Valerie.
You never know what you're going to find. You look for things that are out of place in their room.
Madsen examined Valerie's bed. He discovered blood spots on a pillow. Oddly, there was no blood on the case.
Was there blood on the pillow here?
Sometimes
Jackson said his daughter had a nosebleed the night before.
Valerie did have nosebleeds, and usually when she did, she'd go to her dad and have her daddy help her take care of him.
she gets nosebleeds.
Jackson explained that Valerie got upset when she saw blood on her bedding,
She already washed them.
so he had washed and replaced the bedding just prior to Valerie's disappearance. Madsen looked for other evidence of a nosebleed, such as a bloody tissue, but found none. He instructed crime technicians to collect both the pillows and bed sheets for further examination. While searching the house, Madsen made a potentially important discovery: Valerie's diary. He instructed crime technicians to bag and collect it. Outside, police continued knocking on doors and asking neighbors if they saw or knew anything about Valerie's disappearance. No one had any helpful information. The neighbors told police Brad Jackson seemed like a devoted father and that Valerie was a very sweet girl.
We're going to ask him on ours too, but we don't know if we'll do it or not.
Madsen had three possible theories of what might have happened to Valerie.
The first was that she was abducted by an unknown abductor. The second being that maybe her birth mother or someone for her birth mother had came and took her. And then the third was that a family member had caused her to disappear, and that narrowed down to Brad.
To try to prove his suspicions, Madsen turned his attention to the items recovered from the house.
Not real specific, but yeah, it goes over.
He found some disturbing entries in Valerie's diary.
She was upset with her dad over a birthday party that she just had, like about 2 weeks before, and he embarrassed her. And then there was notations that he wasn't respecting her privacy, like in her bedroom, and was just coming in unannounced.
Less than a week before her disappearance, Valerie wrote about her father. "He won't leave me alone in my room."
There wasn't anything really concrete, but it did raise a red flag.
Madsen had Jackson's pickup truck towed to the sheriff's department. It was processed by forensic specialist Craig Kopic.
Take a swab of this. We approach it in a methodical fashion so that we don't overlook any evidence. In this particular case, we were looking for soil, hair fiber, body fluids.
Kopic first examined the exterior of the vehicle. He discovered several mysterious spots on the front passenger side bumper. He swabbed the residue in order to send it out for testing. For the truck's interior search, the door was pulled shut and the garage lights were turned off.
We used a forensic light source or an alternate light source to view the interior of the vehicle. Certain things such as body fluids and hairs and fibers will fluoresce, so we can document it and collect them.
Other than the mysterious residue on the bumper, no significant evidence was recovered from the truck. They would have to wait to see what the residue was. As investigators tried to make sense of the scant evidence, they feared they were wasting precious time. Valerie Jackson was missing. And if police didn't find her soon, they feared their missing persons case might become a homicide. In Spokane, Washington, 9-year-old Valerie Jackson had been missing for more than a week. The police had very little to go on. But they suspected that the girl's father, Brad Jackson, had something to hide. Madsen asked him if he'd take a polygraph exam.
Begin asking you a few questions here.
Jackson consented. It was administered by Larry Miller.
Did you cause the disappearance of your daughter on October 18th?
No.
On October 18th, were you the one who made your daughter disappear?
No.
The results of Brad Jackson's polygraph test clearly indicated that he was being deceptive to the relevant questions. The relevant questions included the specific issue of whether or not he was involved, responsible for the disappearance of his daughter on October 18th, and whether or not he knew the location of his daughter at the present time.
No.
As the results of the polygraph exam are not admissible in court, Jackson was released after taking the exam. If Jackson had harmed his daughter, then Madsen and his team would have to prove it.
Okay, bringing everyone up to date.
Madsen gathered a team of detectives to plan the next move. The test results from the mysterious residue found on the truck's bumper tested positive for human blood.
Brad's tentatively going to take a polygraph.
Time was running out, and the investigators were beginning to fear they would never find Valerie Jackson alive. They believed that if they followed Jackson, he might inadvertently lead them to the evidence they needed. But putting a full-time surveillance team on him would be nearly impossible. They had to find another way.
We've got his truck. Why don't we put GPS on his vehicles?
Someone came up with the idea of using the GPS to track his vehicle movements. We decided we were going to try to do that. The ultimate goal was hopefully for him to lead us to where Valerie was. Secondary goal was to find out who he was contacting, and so we could contact those people to do follow-up interviews with them in regards to anything they may know about the case or what Brad was doing.
If working properly, the GPS unit would transmit a signal to orbital satellites. Detective Don McCabe could then download that information on his computer and track everywhere Jackson's truck traveled in real time.
And that is printed out in latitude and longitude, date and time. It'll give you an address if you want the address.
Brad, before you leave,
With the unit installed, Madsen called Jackson to pick up his truck. The investigation team would now have to hope Jackson would lead them to Valerie. As he was handing over the keys, Madsen made a bold move.
I told him point blank that I knew he'd killed Valerie, and I knew that he probably buried her, that he didn't have time to bury her deep enough, that animals would dig her up, and we would find her body, and when we did, we would have the evidence we needed to convict him of murdering Valerie. His only reaction, and he, no emotion, no nothing, just looked straight at me and said, "I understand."
Jackson took the keys and drove off. And Detective McCabe was tracking his every move. Over the first couple of days, the GPS unit worked perfectly, and McCabe knew where Jackson's truck was at all times. Then, suddenly, the signal was lost. He could no longer watch Jackson in real time. McCabe would have to wait a few weeks and hope the unit was still recording the data.
Don McCabe in Spokane. Hey, I'm having a problem. I can't bring up the tracker. I've tried everything.
If the information was there, he would have to download it after the unit was taken off the truck.
There isn't any way way that you can think of.
After more than 2 weeks, Madsen decided it was time to try to retrieve the tracking information. He got a warrant for deputies to seize Jackson's truck. Detective McCabe then removed the GPS unit. And with Madsen at his side, he began downloading the data. To their relief, within moments, the exact routes of Jackson's travels were displayed on a computer monitor.
There were a couple of places that really stuck out as, gee, that's a strange place for him to be. And one of the places was Vicari Road.
Is he going across I-90 and up Argonne now?
Yeah.
Vicari Road was located in a remote wilderness area 20 miles outside of Spokane.
He was there on the 10th of November for about 15 minutes, just short of 15 minutes. He then went directly from there up to the Springdale area, where he spent another almost 30 minutes in that area before coming back to Spokane.
Now, isn't that where you showed me on the 6th?
Springdale was also a remote and wooded location. It was an old abandoned logging site. Madsen believed these 2 stops meant his blunt warning to Jackson might have worked. Perhaps Jackson had buried his daughter's body at Vicari Road after her death. Now, fearing the body would be found, he exhumed it and buried it again in Springdale.
Everything else is in town.
Madsen assembled a team of investigators and took off for Vicari Road. Using a handheld GPS unit, Madsen located the exact spot where Jackson parked his truck.
This is the GPS locations where the vehicle stopped. I think that this is probably our best side of the road.
He then instructed his team to fan out over the area, looking for disturbed soil, footprints, clothing, or anything else out of the ordinary. The team included a cadaver dog and his handler.
Hopefully, you'll be able to find something and just look. If you see something, shout it out and check on it.
After only a few minutes, the dog picked up a scent near some overturned soil, a potential grave site.
Change over here. He's liking this.
All right, let's get him out of there. Kevin?
Madsen called forensic scientist Kevin Jenkins to the spot. Jenkins noticed a boot print.
It was pretty obvious when we got there. We just had to make sure not to disturb it. Once we were ready to process it, we used what's called dental stone. It's a hard plaster mixed with water at the scene and poured onto the site.
Jenkins made a cast of the print, knowing that later on it could be compared and possibly matched to boots owned by Jackson. Another forensic scientist, Bill Schneck, collected several soil samples from the area.
We wanted to look at the soil samples and compare it to any other physical evidence that may be in the suspect's environment, say his house or any tools or clothing that he may have.
Just as the team was getting ready to leave, they made another discovery. One of the investigators dug up 2 plastic grocery bags stuck together with duct tape. The bags appeared to be blood-stained, and hair was stuck to the duct tape. It was red hair, the same color as Valerie Jackson's. But they didn't find a body.
Led us to believe that most likely Valerie had been buried there and removed most recently.
Madsen and his team moved on to the second site Jackson had driven to days earlier in Springdale. They hoped that here they would find the evidence they so desperately sought. If not, they feared a suspected murderer would go free. In Spokane, Washington, 9-year-old Valerie Jackson had been missing for nearly a month. Her father, Brad Jackson, was the primary suspect. Investigators used GPS to locate a possible burial site for the missing girl. It was a heavily wooded, abandoned logging site.
This is where the GPS coordinates stop.
Investigator Dave Madsen's entire case depended on whether Valerie was buried somewhere in these woods.
We felt all along that if Brad was involved, there was no other explanation other than she was going to be dead.
He directed the team to first inspect the roadside for evidence. Almost immediately, they spotted tire tracks leading into the woods.
Kevin?
Forensic scientists Kevin Jenkins and Bill Schneck made a plaster cast of the track. Later on, they would compare the tire tread impression in the cast to the tires on Jackson's truck. The team then spread out and walked through the woods looking for overturned dirt or any other sign that might lead them to Valerie. Suddenly, a cadaver dog picked up a scent and led its handler to the origin. Madsen was called over and saw that the spot contained loose, overturned soil. The forensics team began a very delicate excavation of the site. Within moments, they found what they were looking for.
Hey, Dave, why don't you come here, man? I think we got something.
Pink fabric, like the sweater Valerie was last seen in, and human tissue.
Looks like there's some.
The body of a young girl was then removed from the gravesite. It was later identified as that of Valerie Jackson.
Looks like.
It was very quiet when we found Valerie, when she was finally uncovered in the gravesite. You always want to find a child alive when they're missing. It was what we probably expected, but it was still, there was grief and remorse in regards to it because the finality, I guess, sunk in with people that she was in fact dead. And so, yeah, it was a sad moment.
With the recovery of Valerie's body, the investigation was far from over. The forensics team did another search of Jackson's home. They seized items that could potentially be linked to the evidence collected in the field. A roll of duct tape, 2 shovels, and a pair of boots belonging to Brad Jackson. Forensic scientist Bill Schneck, who had collected soil samples from both the Vicari Road and Springdale sites, was now collecting dirt from the wheel wells and floor of Jackson's truck.
By comparing soil samples from the truck and the crime scenes, we're looking for similarities in composition to see if the soil from the vehicles could have come from the crime scene.
At the same time, Kevin Jenkins was making an impression of the truck's tire to see if it matched the one cast at the site where Valerie's body was recovered.
To get a known impression from Jackson's truck, we apply a thin coat of petroleum jelly to the tire. We then very slowly roll the tire over white artboard. This applies the impression of the tire in the petroleum jelly onto the white artboard. We then can use black magnetic fingerprint powder to enhance that impression and make it darker.
As the investigation continued to move forward, the county medical examiner performed an autopsy on Valerie Jackson. Her report listed the cause of death as suffocation. Back at the state crime lab, Kevin Jenkins was comparing the tire impression taken from Jackson's truck to the cast he made in the field.
Ultimately, what we hope to find is what's called an accidental characteristic. An accidental characteristic is a nick or a cut, something that's not there from the manufacturer of the tire, or is there on many tires, something individual to that tire. If we can find that, then we will be able to say that that tire made that impression to the exclusion of all others.
Jenkins declared they were an exact match.
Matching up the tire print from the Jackson's vehicle to the tire print from the Springdale site, from the second burial site, was very important because it helped us to establish that Brad Jackson, or that vehicle, had been in that area.
Investigators had now placed Jackson's truck at the scene. Now they had to place him there. Forensic scientists began comparison testing on nearly 24 soil samples collected from both grave sites and Jackson's boots, shovels, and truck. Bill Schneck conducted the test.
The soil analysis is rather significant because it tied the suspect, Jackson, to the grave site where Valerie was found. There was soil on his boots, soil on shovels, which was similar to the soil from the grave, so actually tied him going to the grave.
Forensic examiners were also able to lift fingerprints off the grocery bags from the Vicari Road site. The prints came back as a match to Brad Jackson. Madsen's case against Brad Jackson was now complete.
Obviously, the GPS was the biggest turning point. Without the GPS, there's a good chance we never would have found Valerie, and we may never have had the evidence to convict Brad in regards to this case.
During the course of the investigation, Brad Jackson threatened to take his own life. He was now being held at a local hospital on suicide watch. Doctors approved his release, and Madsen arrested him for the murder of his daughter.
Everything's good, Doctor. Good physical health.
Police may never know why Jackson killed his daughter. He has never spoken about the crime. On October 5th, 2000, a jury found Brad Jackson guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to 56 years in prison.
I was very pleased that the jury convicted him, but I was also sad for his family because not only did they lose their granddaughter, and to Karen Jackson, Valerie was almost like a daughter, but they lost their son. So there's a lot of sadness for them.
Taking the life of a child is an unconscionable act. It's a tragedy that can strike even the safest neighborhoods. St. Louis, Missouri is a good place to raise a family. At least, that's what Rhonda Center thought. A single mom who shared a home with her friend, Thomas Siegel, Rhonda was raising her 10-year-old daughter, Cassidy, here. On December 1st, 1993, Rhonda arrived home from work. She greeted Siegel and asked if he knew where Cassidy was. Siegel said she had gone to a friend's home and was due back at 5 o'clock.
What do you want for dinner, huh?
It was now 10 minutes after 5. Cassidy wasn't usually late, so Rhonda called the friend's home to check on her.
Hi. Can you go ahead and send Cassidy home?
Her friend said Cassidy never arrived.
What do you mean? What are you talking about? She didn't make it. Are you sure? She said she never made it.
Never made it.
No. We've got to go find her.
Rhonda asked Siegel to help her look for Cassidy. While Siegel walked up and down the street calling out for Cassidy, Rhonda went next door.
Cassidy!
She asked if the neighbor had seen Cassidy that afternoon.
Have you seen my daughter, Cassidy? She didn't come home.
She had not.
Cassidy!
Siegel called the police. When the patrol car arrived, Siegel met it outside his house.
Your roommate?
He told the officer he last saw Cassidy at 3:30, and a neighbor reported seeing her at 3:45. She told Siegel she was going to a friend's house and would be back at 5 p.m. The same time her mother usually arrived home from work. Cassidy always carried a personal alarm when she went out to play.
Remember Mom showed you this?
As he had done many times before, Siegel checked the alarm to be sure it was working. He confirmed it was, then told Cassidy he'd see her at 5.
Okay.
She left and never returned.
Right? Okay. You kids have fun, okay?
Siegel described for police what she was wearing: a blue denim jacket, a pink sweatshirt, jeans, and white sneakers. Officers began canvassing the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen Cassidy or any unusual activity. A canine unit was also called in to try to pick up Cassidy's trail. A short time later, Detective Laura Nearing of the St. Louis County Police Department arrived to investigate.
What made this case of particular interest was the fact that within the last 2 months before that, there were 2 other girls who were missing and later found killed. It brought it to our attention right away that we might be dealing with a serial offender.
About a block and a half away, a man found a personal alarm outside his home.
Finding the personal alarm gave us more of an indication that she was probably taken against her will, as opposed to just maybe being off with friends and not knowing about it. So it right away it started our focus as treating this as an abduction, as opposed to just a missing juvenile.
The man who found the alarm had not witnessed any unusual activity. The investigators decided to check with the people next door to see if they had seen anything. No one answered the door. They would have to come back later. Rhonda recognized the personal alarm as Cassidy's. Nearing asked for a recent photo of Cassidy. She then asked for permission to look through Cassidy's room for any clues as to what might have happened to her. In Cassidy's bedroom, crime technicians began collecting items that might have her fingerprints or DNA on them. A hairbrush, a videotape, a glass from the bedside table.
All right, guys.
If the unthinkable had happened, the prints and DNA would be needed to identify Cassidy. Nearing also searched Cassidy's backpack, looking through notebooks and reading notes passed between Cassidy and her friends.
We knew she just came home from school. We wanted to see if we could get an indication of who she might have been talking to, where she planned to go. A lot of times kids will write notes to each other. They'll write just their thoughts in books and things like that.
Detective Nearing was meeting with a team of detectives known as the Greater St. Louis Major Case Squad, or MCS. The squad was already investigating the deaths of 2 other girls who were first reported missing just prior to Cassidy's disappearance. One victim was a girl close to Cassidy's age. The other was 22 years old. The MCS detective suspected there was a link among the 3.
So it was very important that we compare notes, because as leads came in, if they weren't related to Cassidy Center, they could have been related to one of the other homicides, and those investigators needed to have that information also.
If these cases were linked, then a serial killer was prowling the streets of St. Louis, preying on young women and girls. And until he was caught, no one was safe. In 1993, St. Louis police feared a serial killer was on the loose when 10-year-old Cassidy Center went to visit a friend after school and never arrived. She was the 3rd girl to disappear. When news of her disappearance hit the papers, investigators printed new missing person flyers with a more recent photo of Cassidy and asked detectives to again canvass the neighborhood residents for information.
Hey, you guys, we got some new posters to get out.
Detective Nearing was especially interested in the house next door to the one where the personal alarm was found. Detectives had gone there on a daily basis since Cassidy's disappearance, but never found anyone at home.
Great, thanks.
This time, nearly a week after Cassidy was reported missing, Gloria Cooper answered the door. Detectives asked about her whereabouts since the disappearance.
Can you tell me where you were on
Cooper
December
explained
1st?
that she had to stay with some friends because the power company had cut off her electricity. It had only been turned on the day before. When asked about Cassidy, Cooper said she knew nothing.
Turned off for?
She also mentioned her brother, who sometimes lived with her.
10 days ago?
Detectives went to talk with Cooper's brother.
So where do you normally sleep?
He told them because the electricity was off, he wasn't at the house the day she vanished.
Okay, so
He had to be at work at 4 p.m.
do you have something to verify that you're at work?
Sure, I mean, yeah, I got my time card.
Brooks showed the detectives his time card from December 1st. He clocked in at 4:07 and clocked out at 11:30 p.m., potentially clearing Brooks as a suspect.
Clocked out at 11:30.
Knowing that a neighbor saw her at 3:45 and he clocked in at 4:07, there wasn't much of a time there for someone to abduct somebody and potentially murder them in that short a span.
Police hit another dead end. But on December 9th, 8 days after Cassidy's disappearance, they got a break. Two teenagers were walking down a St. Louis alley when they noticed a bundle of blankets lying against a wall.
What is that?
As the boys approached, they were shocked to see a leg sticking out from the blankets.
When the city police arrived, they immediately suspected that this was Cassidy and knew what was going on. So they called us right away, which helped. We were able to get down there and be part of processing the scene and making sure all the evidence was obtained that we were going to need to help hopefully identify a suspect.
The body, a young girl wearing clothing that matched Cassidy's, was wrapped inside a curtain underneath a blanket.
The evidence at the scene didn't connect us to any particular person. We knew we had a comforter, a blanket, a curtain. We had these items, but we didn't know where they came from.
Looks like we got some tire tracks here.
Tire tracks were also found in the alley near the body.
There's stuff out there.
Crime technicians took a dental stone cast of the track to use as evidence. Working from fingerprints taken from the victim, Detective Donald Bryan compared them to the print cards he made from the items recovered from Cassidy's room. Forensic scientists at the St. Louis Crime Lab examined the blanket found covering Cassidy for evidence that might lead them to the killer. They discovered several hairs that were later identified as coming from an African American. They also collected beige fibers and aluminum scrapings.
We were able to take the blankets and the curtains that she was found wrapped in. We were able to get pictures of that out. I believe that was even shown on the news, that if anybody recognizes these items, to contact us.
Investigators were still hoping for a lead that would point them to the killer, and they feared they were running out of time. Detectives were determined to find Cassidy's killer before he struck again. Detectives in St. Louis, Missouri found the body of 10-year-old Cassidy Center. She had been missing for 8 days. They feared she was the latest victim of a serial killer. Cassidy was the third female killed in the last few months. But the theory that Cassidy's death was related to the other two was seeming less likely.
the area of the city where she was disposed of was an inconsistent pattern from what we would have expected with the other cases. Believing that we were now dealing with individual perpetrators, we focused more on our case in particular rather than the collective evidence of all these cases.
Investigators then turned to the strongest evidence they had, the African-American hair found with the body. Detectives went back to talk with Cassidy's neighbor, Gloria Cooper. Cooper had claimed she was not home at the time of the disappearance because the power company had turned off her electricity. Detective Laura Nearing, who was heading up the investigation, decided to confirm Cooper's story with a call to the power company.
They really did have power the whole time. We were given information that their story was incorrect and power had never been cut off to that house. So right away we're thinking they're lying to us, and why are they telling us they weren't there, and why are they using that as an excuse?
Really, this only takes a minute.
This new development prompted detectives to pay another visit to Gloria Cooper's home.
Where were you on December 1st?
This time, her boyfriend, Adam Jenkins, was with her. The detectives asked Jenkins where he was on the day Cassidy disappeared. He said he was out of town.
Anybody back there?
Cooper then gave the detectives permission to look around the house.
So, who has keys to the house?
In one of the bedrooms, they made note of the beige carpeting. It was a similar color to the fibers found on the blankets covering Cassidy's body. There were also no curtains on the windows, nor bedclothes on the bed. If someone in the Cooper house was involved in the murder, then police would have to find a way to prove it. At the St. Louis Crime Lab, Detective Daniel Jackson was processing the tire impressions taken from the alley where Cassidy's body was found. After examining the tread characteristics, Jackson was able to determine the specific make of tire that made the track in the alley.
It came out to be a tire that goes on certain types of trucks, utility vehicles, vans, that sort of thing.
After we learned the information about the tire in particular, and that it was a unique tire, it was important to identify what vehicles were in the area.
Detectives again canvassed the
How you
neighborhood.
doing, sir? Hey, how you doing?
Their persistence seemed to pay off right away. One resident recalled that on December 9th, the day before Cassidy's body was discovered, he saw a rental truck in front of the Cooper's home at 6:30 a.m. Two African-American men got into the truck and sped off so fast that they struck a mailbox at the end of the driveway.
When the information came back of this truck, a light bulb went on with us. We knew right away this is what we were looking for. We already knew that within the bedding that our victim was found, there were aluminum shavings. We knew right away that this is probably our vehicle. Oh, here's one here.
It was also the kind of truck that would have the type of tires that left the tracks in the alley where Cassidy was found. Now they needed to find it. Nearing checked the yellow pages for truck rental agencies. She found one located near Cooper's neighborhood and sent a detective to investigate.
Great, he's gonna be there.
Cooper's brother, Thomas Brooks, rented the truck on December 8th and returned it on December 9th. The agent showed the detectives the specific truck Brooks rented. The truck was then impounded for processing. The tires were the same make as those identified through the cast impression taken from the crime scene. Comparing them to the plaster casts taken earlier, they found they were the exact tires. Detectives also vacuumed the inside of the truck for trace evidence that might match the paint and other shavings lifted from the blankets covering the body. The truck was dusted for prints. Detective Nearing now had enough evidence to obtain a warrant for a more thorough search of Gloria Cooper's home. While searching Cooper's basement, one of the crime technicians found a pin. It was the same kind used on personal alarms like the one Cassidy carried. The technicians also identified, swabbed, and collected several blood stains from the floor. At the St. Louis County Crime Lab, forensic scientist Alan Derrickson found a positive match between the blood found in Cooper's basement and Cassidy's DNA. Investigators next wanted to talk to the people who had access to Cooper's home.
Information that you don't even know about.
They brought in Adam Jenkins, Gloria Cooper's boyfriend.
You know why we want to talk to you? About the little girl being killed.
The detectives informed him that there was now solid evidence that someone from the Cooper's home killed Cassidy. Jenkins told the detectives that Gloria Cooper didn't kill Cassidy,
and she was murdered,
but discovered her body in the basement.
All she said was that there was...
Jenkins went on to say that Cooper insisted her brother get rid of it. So Thomas Brooks rented a truck, and Jenkins helped him dispose of Cassidy's body in the St. Louis alley where it was discovered.
Did you ever go back to the house where your girlfriend was living?
Detective Nearing then interrogated Gloria Cooper.
Who I've been talking to?
No.
Nearing informed her that her boyfriend told them everything, and that they even knew about the rental truck.
We need your
Cooper
version.
finally broke.
The only version I have, okay, I came home.
She admitted to finding Cassidy's body in the basement and demanding that Brooks remove it. She said she lied to detectives because her brother had threatened to hurt her children if she said anything.
Didn't know what to do, so I called my brother.
Cooper also confirmed that the blanket and curtain in the photos came from her house. She was then placed under arrest for obstruction of justice. Police then picked up Thomas Brooks at his father's home and brought him in for questioning.
10-year-old girls do not approach.
Brooks still denied any knowledge of the incident.
You need to tell me the truth.
But consented to give a hair sample.
Tell me what happened.
When detectives told him that Adam Jenkins rolled on him, his story changed.
Okay.
Brooks admitted the truth.
Pulled the alarm.
He had tried to assault Cassidy.
Went off and it was loud.
She fought with him, and he hit her with a bed slat, killing her. He covered her body with a blanket and hid her in the basement. Brooks then rushed to his job at the fast food restaurant, clocking in 7 minutes late. After confessing, Brooks was placed under arrest. The hair sample Brooks gave to the detectives came up as a positive DNA match to the hair sample removed from the blanket Cassidy was found in. Thomas Brooks was convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping. He was sentenced to death. Gloria Cooper and Adam Jenkins were both convicted on obstruction of justice charges. There will never be a way to ease the pain of loved ones left behind after a murder has been committed. But thanks to forensic science and its dedicated practitioners, justice is often served for the murders that result in stolen youth. In Canada, a young Russian woman is found dead in a bathtub, beaten and drowned in her own blood. Men fell victim to her charms, and police find at least 3 suspects with the means and motive to commit the crime. In New Jersey, a woman disappears without a trace. For years, police trail her husband and search for a mysterious box, the gruesome contents of which may prove his guilt.
It's a dead body.
A victim usually never foresees danger. when the perpetrator turns out to be a friend or a lover. Science and microscopic evidence can unmask these killers and find justice for those who are loved to death. In this program, some of the names of the participants have been changed to protect their identity. Toronto, Canada is a gleaming, bustling metropolis, rising high above the shores of Lake Ontario. Each year, thousands of immigrants find homes in this international city. For some, the journey leads only to danger and heartbreak. On January 12, 1995, Mark Milligan and Gilbert Ho arrived at the home of a friend, a 23-year-old woman named Paulina Gerasimov. Paulina had been missing for days, and her friends convinced the building superintendent to let them in. Her door was unlocked. The apartment was neat, clean, and eerily quiet. Gilbert Ho went to check the bedroom, and there he made a shocking discovery. The room was in disarray, the bed spattered with blood. It was a horrific, violent scene. But in the bathroom was something more brutal. In the bathtub lay a woman's body, submerged in bloody water. The skull had been shattered, but they knew it was Paulina. They called police.
Arlington 911, what do you report?
Police dispatch received a frantic call from Gilbert Ho at 1:40 p.m.
They say that they're looking
Detective Sergeant Ken Taylor of the Toronto Police Homicide Squad was assigned the case with his partner, Detective Sergeant Mike Hamill. The witnesses were asked to give statements at police headquarters. Ken Taylor recalls the scene.
When we first arrived at the scene, we took a quick look just to get an idea as to what we would be dealing with. The door was open, and as I turned to the left, the bathroom is on the left as you're looking in the apartment. I could see a female lying in the bathtub. The door to the patio or to the balcony was open about 6 inches. It was a cold night, and it had been cold for a number of days, so that's why the apartment was so cold.
Investigators found a dog, which they removed from the premises. Detective Sergeant Mike Hamill.
The dog even was eating out of the dog food.
Whoever did this cared about her dog. There was some water in the dish on the floor as well. And I suspect the balcony door was left open for the dog to be able to go outside.
That's pretty interesting. Nobody broke in, so that suggests to us as homicide investigators that she knew who the killer was, and that the killer either let himself in or she let the killer in.
The bedroom had clearly seen the greatest share of violence. Blood was spattered on pillows, sheets, and up the wall. Though their victim was found in the tub, she was clearly beaten here, and savagely. Detectives spotted a curious ring of dried blood, which indicated that something had been placed atop the dresser during or after the crime. They later found a cup of the same size in the bathroom. Police theorized that while the killer was cleaning up after the murder, he'd made himself a cup of tea.
Whoever it was comfortable in the apartment, probably knew that nobody else would be coming, and he had plenty of time to clean up.
Toronto Police Detective Richard Wisnowski of the Forensic Identification Services was dispatched to the apartment that afternoon. The victim appeared to have been dead for several days.
The first thing that I did was to photograph all the rooms in detail and then to start collecting any evidence that might prove useful to the investigation. Under the body in the bathtub, I found a hammer, which was most likely the murder weapon.
The detective also observed disinfectant cleanser in the bath.
This was a unique crime scene that I have not encountered very often, in the fact that there was the brutality of the murder and the condition that the body was left in.
Throughout the bathroom, Detective Wisnowski dusted for prints.
If it was a stranger-to-stranger homicide, then fingerprints and any evidence left in the apartment would be very important.
In the living room, he collected an answering machine tape, which could also help clarify time of death. But it was the signs of violence in the bedroom that seemed the most perplexing. The drawers of the dresser were open and clothes were scattered around, but it appeared that nothing of value was taken.
It wasn't a true robbery in the sense what I've experienced in the past. It looks like it was a staged incident, and it was a cover-up for the true intention was to commit the murder.
At police headquarters, detectives took statements from Paulina's two friends who had discovered her body. Mark Milligan had grown concerned when she wasn't answering her phone and had missed class for several days.
Yes. Did that today.
Paulina, he explained, was an art student at a local university.
Decided to go.
He was at that apartment because of his concern, because nobody had seen or heard from Paulina for quite some time. He was obvious, it stood right out at us that he was a friend, never a suspect.
Gilbert Ho was a boss of Paulina's at a bar where they worked in downtown Toronto.
Mr. Ho was very cooperative with us. He was, from what I understand, the one who started the sort of search party for Paulina.
But unlike Milligan, detectives were not able to cross him off their suspect list. He told police he was having an affair with Paulina.
Oh, well.
He was paying bulk of her rent, and it was obvious from what he said that he cared for her very much.
Gilbert Ho had last seen Paulina earlier that week, on Monday, January 9th.
I've never seen this one before.
Certainly hope so.
The two had eaten dinner and were planning to spend the evening in her apartment
Hey, sweetie.
when she received a phone call.
How are you?
Ho explained to detectives that he was not disturbed by the call.
You're more than welcome.
Paulina was very pretty, and he'd long ago accepted the fact that she had many men in her life.
You sure? Yeah.
She asked Ho to leave around 1:30 in the morning.
Yeah, see you later.
He assumed she was expecting another guest. In the days that followed, he left several messages on her answering machine, but she never called back. Paulina's body was sent to the office of the chief coroner in Toronto. An autopsy was conducted the day after Paulina was found. Although her body had lain out for days, the pathologist's task was made easier thanks to the bathtub's cool water and the wintry air rushing in from the balcony. Acting Chief Coroner, Dr. Barry McClellan.
So in a case like this, where the body is found in a cooler environment, that in fact is a benefit to us when it comes to preserving the tissues and conducting the autopsy examination.
They found ligature marks where she was bound at the wrists and ankles, and defensive wounds on her hands and arms.
She had an excess of 20 blows to her head, and the pathologist at the autopsy felt that the hammer was consistent with the injuries.
Doctors believe that Paulina, though severely beaten, was still alive when she was tied up and placed in her bathtub.
The cause of death was determined to be blunt force head injuries with possible terminal drowning.
Two clues warranted further investigation: semen found in the body and a human bite mark located on her upper body. Police would have to wait for a final autopsy report. Neighbors confirmed that Paulina had several men in her life, including a husband, a man named Ivan Joseph. Joseph was a businessman who had recently moved to Calgary, some 2,000 miles away.
He came to Toronto within a couple of days to be interviewed. She was estranged from her husband. As a matter of fact, they were going through divorce proceedings.
He explained that he had last spoken to his wife on Monday evening, shortly before her dinner with Gilbert Ho. During that phone call, she told him that she would be sending him papers that would finalize their divorce. Ivan Joseph had known Paulina in Russia. The two had been high school sweethearts.
How are you?
He immigrated to Canada in 1990. Paulina followed 2 years later. Within 4 months, the two were married, eager to start a new life for themselves in Toronto.
The relationship was good at the start, and then she started working, she started getting more confident in herself, and they just sort of grew away.
Joseph told police Paulina began coming home from work later and later. And the newlyweds began arguing with increasing regularity.
Oh, thanks for making dinner.
After only 3 months, the couple separated.
Relax.
We're supposed to spend time.
For the last 2 years, they had lived apart.
I don't have time for this.
Well, where have you been?
Ivan Joseph insisted that he and Paulina had remained friends.
Who have you been with tonight?
I was out with my girlfriends. I had errands to run. We can talk.
Police, however, were suspicious.
Her husband was in Calgary at the time, but that doesn't mean that he couldn't have arranged something here for her. That nobody heard from her after this particular day was suspicious to us.
Hi, Mike.
Detectives now had 2 suspects to pursue, Gilbert Ho and Ivan Joseph. But with each day, it seemed, their list of possible perpetrators grew.
Ex-boyfriend? Yeah.
According to friends, Paulina led an active social life and began dating a third man soon after her separation. She moved in with him in the fall of 1992.
I always keep my promises to you.
His name was Ed Casco. The two had an on-again, off-again relationship. After an argument, she eventually moved out in the summer of '94, 5 months before her death.
You know, bad girl.
Detectives were eager to learn more about this man and called him in for questioning. Like their other suspects, Casco was cooperative and seemed affected by Paulina's death. Though she'd left him and moved into the apartment provided by Gilbert Ho, the two still saw each other on occasion. Casco admitted meeting her on Friday, January 6th. He slept with her that night and left the next day. Detectives recalled Gilbert Ho's statement about a late-night guest Paulina was expecting. But Casco denied coming over to see her late on Monday night, January 9th, the last day Paulina was seen alive. Police now had to eliminate 2 of the 3 suspects. They looked to Paulina's body for clues as to which of the men who loved her killed her. In 1995, a young Russian woman living in Toronto was found brutally slain. Paulina Gerasimov was struck 20 times in the head with a hammer and left to drown in a bathtub. 3 men, all current or former lovers, were under suspicion. Detective Mike Hamill.
It's a process of elimination. You start off with a number of suspects, but the quicker you eliminate the less important suspects, the more time you will have to focus on your number 1 suspect.
Investigators turned to Ron LeBlanc, hoping to gain a better understanding of their victim.
Thanks, sir.
LeBlanc was the owner of a Toronto bar where the victim had worked. Gilbert Ho also worked at the bar. And Ed Casco was a customer there.
Just about the beer.
Gilbert Ho was our bar manager at the time. He was so distracted with her in every which way that he grew just progressively inefficient.
So you're hearing what I'm saying?
He started to spiral out of control because he could not concentrate anymore.
LeBlanc informed detectives that he had been forced to fire both Gilbert Ho and Paulina Gerasimov in the fall. Their trip to the bar left detectives with more questions than answers.
I can't think of any reasons why anyone would want to kill her. She was a fun-loving, easy person. She got along with everybody. She had no enemies in the world.
Detectives hoped her body could point them in the right direction. At the coroner's office, Dr. Robert Wood made a mold of the bite mark on the victim's body, pouring a quick-drying silicone-based cast onto the wound.
That is flowed over the skin, and then multiple layers are put on and allowed to set. We use this material in conventional dentistry, and it is extremely accurate.
The bite mark impression was like a three-dimensional fingerprint with unique characteristics that could ID a killer. The next step was to compare the bite radius of each suspect. Detectives asked each man to come to police headquarters and meet with a dentist.
That would, in our opinion at that time, rule these people in, rule them out. Just open for me.
Doctors took skin cells for DNA comparison and made models of each man's teeth.
Now that can be done by any dentist, but I prefer to do the impressions when I can myself. And that impression-making process is essentially identical to anything that anyone would have done in private general dental practice. And we will also just look to see if there are any loose teeth, recently extracted teeth, teeth that have been possibly altered, just to make sure that there hasn't been anything done in order to disguise a dentition.
While Wood created his dental molds, forensic biologist Dr. Susan Kern analyzed DNA.
When we do the analysis, we have a known sample from the victim, we have a known sample from an accused or suspect, and then we have our unknown sample. We would do the profile for all of those samples and then look between them and see where we have similarities and where we have differences.
Kern compared samples from each suspect to DNA taken from the semen found in the victim. She examined the DNA provided by Paulina's husband, Ivan Joseph, comparing it to the sample found at the autopsy. After there was no match, she repeated the procedure with Gilbert Ho's DNA sample. Once again, there was no match. A third chart, and the same intricate patterns painstakingly traced. And there it was, 2 charts, their patterns in perfect alignment. It was Ed Casco, her longtime boyfriend.
The ex-boyfriend seemed to be, at the time of her death, very much involved with her.
Casco admitted to police that he and Paulina had quarreled on the phone Sunday, 2 days after he had last seen her. Results from the dental molds offered detectives another break in the case.
Hello, Kim. I'll send along a report.
After a meticulous comparison, Dr. Wood relayed his findings to police.
In bite mark analysis, often we will rule people out as well as rule them in. In this case, 2 people could be definitely ruled out, and 1 could not be ruled out.
One of the suspects that Dr. Wood ruled out was Ed Casco. In 1995, Toronto police investigating the brutal death of a young Russian woman had narrowed their field of suspects to 2. DNA evidence proved that Paulina Gerasimov had sexual relations with 1 man before her death. The man was Ed Casco, her former boyfriend. Teeth specialist Dr. Robert Wood had ruled out Ed Casco as a suspect. But violent bite marks on the victim matched another suspect, Gilbert Ho.
But we needed something more that would link Mr. Ho to the actual murder, to the body.
Financial records strengthened their case. Ho, who'd been fired from his job, was still paying Paulina's rent. Unemployed, he'd been bouncing checks for months.
Okay, Mr. Ho, have a seat right there, please.
Okay. Hi.
Yeah, you remember Detective Sergeant? So he came down to the division, and we began interviewing him. We told him, as a matter of fact, that we believed, us as investigators, believed you, Mr. Ho, killed Paulina.
Detectives began their questioning by playing messages from the answering machine tape found in Paulina's apartment. The day after her murder, Ho had left several messages. Despite knowing the rent was not paid and she was to be evicted from the apartment, he spoke of getting together with her and buying her groceries.
Okay, talk to you later. He makes several phone calls to her on her answering machine, probably to try and put us off, because he calls, "Hi, Princess, it's Tuesday, where have you been? I miss you."
Police believed that Ho expected Paulina's body would be found that day by police officers coming to evict her. But they never showed up.
He knew that Paulina's body was in the bathtub.
Ho also knew he had no money and had not paid rent on the apartment in months. Detectives confronted him with the state of his finances and asked him to explain the strange contradictions in his story. But he could not. They moved on to a more incriminating piece of evidence, the bite mark. Again, he had no explanation and denied having committed the act. The final autopsy report provided the final piece of the puzzle.
Well, hopefully it'll be good.
Stomach contents found at autopsy indicated that the victim had died about 1 hour after eating dinner on Monday, January 9th.
It's our belief, as a result of the stomach contents, that she was killed sometime around her supper time. The dinner that she was going to have was consistent with what we found at autopsy, and those kind of things, they don't lie. That's fact, that's evidence. She has broccoli, full piece of broccoli in her stomach. She has a full piece of carrot in her stomach. That's evidence, that doesn't go away. So couple that with Mr. Ho's statement that he was with her and nobody else was with her from 1:30 p.m. to 1:30 a.m., it was obvious to me that Mr. Ho killed Paulina.
There remained one unanswered question. If Ho killed Paulina, then how could Ed Casco's semen still be inside the victim? Dr. Susan Kern turned to semen viability studies for answers.
Semen can be typed up to approximately 7 days. This case, the samples were collected additional days after that, and that would have been due to the fact that her body was in a very cold environment. The case occurred in the winter. The door was open, the washroom would be cold where she was found, and the temperature would be number one in slowing down any decomposition of the biological material.
Okay, Mr. Ho.
Detectives finally had their man. Gilbert Ho was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. According to the landlord, Ho had been informed that his tenant would be evicted on January 10th. Police theorized that he never told Paulina, hoping to maintain her affections as long as possible. It was a strategy doomed to failure. Ho had run through his savings. On January 9th, with only hours to go before her eviction, Ho showed up at the apartment
Hi, Gilbert.
for one last night.
How are you?
It's my position that she had no idea that morning that she was going to be evicted because nothing was packed. If she knew she was going to be evicted, you would have thought she's a responsible girl. She would have packed a bag. She wouldn't have just allowed the sheriff to come in, throw everything in garbage bags, and throw it out on the street.
Ho did not leave the apartment as he testified to police. And Paulina was expecting no late-night guest. Gilbert Ho was the last man who saw her alive.
Ho knew that that was the day. That particular day that he killed her, she had to be out the next morning. So he had no choice. That was the night. Because he couldn't afford to continue on with this type of lifestyle with her.
On June 21st, 1996, Gilbert Ho was convicted of the murder of Paulina Gerasimov. He was sentenced to life in prison. The corpse at a crime scene often speaks loudest, offering up clues to a killer. But a murder case is made even tougher when there is no body or crime scene at all. October 2nd, 1991. Deanna Weiss was anxious. Her mother, Fran Smith, should have been home. But for days she'd called and gotten no answer. Finally, a response.
Yeah.
It was John David Smith, her mother's second husband. And what he said shocked her. Smith did not know where her mother was. He thought she had gone to visit her.
Okay, yeah.
Smith felt sure she was overreacting when she insisted he contact police.
All right, bye.
He reluctantly agreed. Smith arrived at police headquarters in West Windsor, New Jersey, to file a missing persons report. He told the officer a couple of days before he had arrived home from work only to find a note left by his wife. It told him to feed the fish, that she would be back in a few days. Confused, he tossed the note in the trash. They'd been married a year and a half. Though she'd recently talked about wanting to travel, this was, for Fran, unusual behavior. Days turned to weeks, and there was still no sign of her. Deanna, Fran's daughter from a previous marriage, arrived in town highly alarmed, as did Fran's sister, Sherry Gladden Davis.
We handed out flyers and we talked to people all up and down the street where Fran worked. There is no way that Fran would have gone anyplace without Dee Dee or I, one, knowing where she was.
The women suspected that Fran's husband had not told the whole story. Local police also had their suspicions. Bob Hilland recalls the case.
I first learned of her disappearance while I was in uniform patrol, and back in the fall of '91. During roll call, we learned that a woman in our town named Fran Smith was missing and to be on the lookout for her.
According to friends and relatives, Fran was a friendly, stable woman who worked as an executive secretary. Her husband was, by all accounts, a quiet, hard-working engineer with a penchant for sports cars. Lead detective Mike Dansbury interviewed Smith several times in the months following the disappearance. Each time, he was left with more questions than answers.
There were a lot of inconsistencies in the initial report that John had provided to the police. Number one, Betty Fran was incapacitated.
A month before she vanished, Fran slipped and broke her hip. She was recovering at home.
Here was a woman who couldn't walk out of her own house or downstairs without the assistance of crutches or a walker. She couldn't drive a car. She didn't have any money, and all of a sudden she vanishes off the face of the earth and nobody knows where she is.
Fran's sister Sherry learned from police that Smith had been married before to a woman named Janice Hartman. She began combing phone books from towns and cities where Smith had lived. After dialing countless numbers, Sherry located Janice's brother.
I said, what's this about? And I said, I understand your sister was married to John Smith, and he said, yes. And I said, well, so was my sister, and she's missing.
His response was shattering.
My sister's been missing since November of 1974.
New Jersey detectives immediately contacted the police in Worcester, Ohio, where the earlier disappearance occurred. Detectives hunted out the old case files and found it bore a striking resemblance to the current mystery. 17 years before his second wife went missing, John Smith was the prime suspect in the disappearance of his first wife. She vanished days after their divorce became final. Her family blamed Smith, but prosecutors had no proof, and he eventually left the state. The woman's body was never found.
Law enforcement's attentions were raised significantly when it was learned that John had been married to another woman in Ohio. That would be Janice Hartman Smith in 1974, and she had disappeared under very similar circumstances. Then everybody became very concerned. What are we dealing with here?
More than a decade earlier, the Janice Hartman Smith case had gone cold. Now detectives had the Fran Smith case, and once again, the trail had gone cold. For more than 2 decades, suspected murderer John David Smith had baffled authorities. First in Ohio in 1974, and then in New Jersey in the 1990s. By 1997, the FBI's cold case squad, based in New York City, was eager to take a crack at him. Leading the new investigation was Bob Hilland, the former New Jersey patrolman, now an FBI agent, dedicated to solving unsolved crimes.
I knew how frustrating it was back in 91, 92, because there was a lot of work put into that case.
Smith's wives had a habit of disappearing, as did Smith, who skipped town once the local authorities gave up the chase.
He was transient by nature. We didn't really know where he was.
Finding a man named John Smith, the right John Smith, would not be easy.
We kind of had to start from scratch as far as going back and generating a timeline of places he had been, places he had lived, places he had worked, people whom he had known.
Hilland tracked down a longtime girlfriend of Smith's in Connecticut. Stubborn at first, she eventually revealed his location, California. Agents located Smith in San Diego and kept him under surveillance. He was working for a custom car manufacturer. They discovered he'd maintained his fondness for sports cars and spouses. Smith had married a 3rd time, and agents were concerned that she would become another victim. In 1998, Bob Hilland led a task force meeting at FBI headquarters in Quantico, Virginia. The plan: to take down John David Smith once and for all.
In the previous investigations, when John was brought in by law enforcement and interviewed, his immediate cause of action when he left the police station, he would go to his family, his friends, anybody that knew him, and he'd say, listen, the police are probably gonna come talk to you. If they talk to you, don't say anything. Don't even speak to them. And he would kind of give them a heads up. So the strategy here was, let's identify everybody in John's life from as far back as 1974 to present day, people who we felt potentially had information or could offer assistance in this case. Then we're going to go out and interview everybody simultaneously.
It took nearly 6 months to coordinate the operation, utilizing scores of agents. On May 5th, 1999, everyone was in position. And at 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, the takedown began in San Diego,
John David Smith? Yes.
the Midwest,
How you doing?
and the East Coast, gathering up relatives, friends, neighbors, anyone who possibly had information that could help solve the mystery of the 2 missing women or prevent the disappearance of even more.
It was just a matter of time. No question in my mind about it.
I'm a special agent.
FBI agent Bob Hilland led the siege, coming face to face with John David Smith outside his office in San Diego. Hilland interviewed Smith in a nearby hotel room.
You should recognize
At
these
first,
people.
he cooperated.
They've been telling us some things that you haven't been
With John, it's like playing cards. He wants to see what the cards law enforcement are holding so he can kind of strategize his next move.
They showed Smith photos of the friends and relatives who were also being interrogated at the same time.
We had a command post set up, and the other interviewers from around the country, as they were getting significant information from their interviews, they would call it into us.
I feel very responsible for what happened.
We made it clear to John that this interview and his interaction with law enforcement was different than any in the past. Now he was dealing with the FBI and the resources of the FBI.
I'm down. We got a couple more questions.
After 8 hours, Smith showed signs of weakening.
Lay down for a little bit.
He started crying. He curled up in a ball. He wrapped himself up in a fetal position, just crying. And he said, I want to cover myself with a blanket. I want the world to go away.
Ground information, please.
The FBI had better luck with John's brother, Frank, who was interrogated back in Ohio. Uncooperative at first, the younger sibling eventually gave in and provided investigators with their strongest lead yet. In November of 1974, just days after Janice Hartman's disappearance, Frank had come across his brother in their grandfather's garage. Prosecutor Jocelyn Stephenson.
He had asked him what was happening, and John told him, I'm building a box to store some of Jan's clothes. He said John sort of got upset about the discussion over the box, so he left. Later that evening, he returned to the garage, and he said it was just weird to him because he'd never seen anyone pack clothing in that manner before.
According to Frank, the box then stayed in the garage, unopened, for years. Then, in 1979, while the garage was being cleaned out, Frank and his grandfather opened the box. At first, he thought it was some rags. A closer inspection, however, revealed kneecaps, severed limbs, a partially decomposed skull. There was also jewelry, including a gold chain with a crucifix. Frank recognized them as belonging to Janice Hartman.
Grandma's heart's too bad. She'd never be able to stand.
His statement to us was, I couldn't do anything for the person in the box, but I was going to protect my grandma. And so he did not call the police. He instead placed a phone call to his brother. John's response was, I'll be right there.
John drove over to the house, put the box into the front seat of his Corvette, and drove away.
That was the last ever seen of it.
His testimony was valuable, but did not assure a slam-dunk case. Frank's grandfather was long dead. No one could confirm the tale.
We had no body. We had no crime scene. And although you can prosecute a no-body homicide case, which is something I was willing to do, it's very difficult.
The FBI searched the property in the area that had once been owned by John Smith or his family. They found no box.
I know that box exists, now we gotta find the box. How do we find the box? It's a proverbial needle in a haystack.
Time was running out. With each passing year, the body, wherever it lay, was decomposing. And evidence that could put John David Smith away for murder was literally turning to dust. In February 2000, FBI officials suspected John David Smith of murder and believed a mysterious box could prove it. In search of the box, Ohio detectives drafted a memo and sent it to law enforcement agencies across the state and neighboring counties in Indiana and Michigan. It was a desperate gambit. Made of plywood and crudely constructed, the box had last been seen in 1979. The chances that it had been found, preserved, and still contained the remains of Smith's first wife were slim indeed. For detectives in Newton County, Indiana, however, the memo triggered a memory.
Newton County Sheriff's Department. He immediately calls the Wayne County Sheriff's Office and says, Brian, I think I've got your girl.
One detective recalled a case from 1980 when he was a young deputy sheriff. A road crew working on a rural county highway had discovered a plywood box. Inside the box, the dismembered remains of a female body. The body was never identified. Locals around town merely called her the lady in the box.
Just by good luck, they still had all the original evidence still in evidence storage. They had the box, they had the contents, they had her jewelry, her crucifix, everything described in the box they had. They had buried her remains in a Jane Doe grave. So she was out in the cemetery. The next step was we have to go to the cemetery and exhume her body.
It was March 3rd, 2000. More than 2.5 decades of police work had come down to this moment.
Now we had a body. We were hoping that we would be able to determine how she died, which is something that's always helpful in any murder case. We also wanted to make sure that we had the right body.
The bones were examined by Dr. Frank Saul, a forensic anthropologist at the Lucas County Coroner's Office.
The skeletal remains were in surprisingly good condition. The elements of the pelvis that told us that she was a female. We then examined the bones directly and radiographically and determined that although she was mature, she was young mature. And we told the agents and the detectives that she was probably in her 20s.
The description matched that of Janice Hartman, who was 23 when she went missing. The cause of death was unknown, though it was clear her legs had been severed just below the knee.
We had just the upper portions of the tibia and fibula. The lower portion of the lower leg, including the ankle portion and the foot on both sides, was missing and never found.
The severed bones were sent on to Dr. Stephen Symes, a forensic anthropologist who specializes in dismemberment.
These striations are so
A close examination revealed telltale striations and cut marks.
There's no patterning, no uniformity, nothing. They're going every which direction.
The cuts were made by hand, with a blade that had a serrated edge and 10 teeth per inch.
Typical carpenter saw that you used to cut a 2x4. Usually has fewer teeth in it. They're a little bit bigger than that. They're 6, 7 teeth per inch, for example. But 10 teeth per inch would be like a big bread knife or something like that you've got at home. It's a very strange thing to find. A serrated knife is very difficult to cut bone with. I would think it would take a lot of persistence.
John had said, if I can't have her, nobody's going to have her, and she'll never walk away from me. So the thought has been discussed that by cutting her legs off, she will physically never walk away from him again.
The final step was DNA analysis at the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. Genetic material extracted from the bones was compared to a sample donated by Hartman's mother. Both samples shared the same DNA sequence. Finally, they had scientific proof. The lady in the box was Janice Hartman. On October 3rd, 2000, John David Smith was arrested in San Diego. Faced with irrefutable evidence in his first wife's murder, investigators hoped Smith would confess to killing his second wife and reveal the location of Fran's body. But Smith refused to talk. Police theorized that Smith murdered Janice and then cut off her legs so she would fit inside the box he'd made.
I don't know what bothers me more, the fact that he cut her legs off or the fact that he kept her dismembered body for 5 years in his grandparents' house.
John's brother Frank received immunity for his testimony.
This secret nearly destroyed him. He told us that he had a nightmare of Janice chasing him and actually striking him with her legs, the legs that had been cut off below the knee. Although he kept silent for 25 years, there was a high personal price for that silence.
Police can only guess at the number of women Smith may have murdered. FBI agent Bob Hillen recalls the photo of a woman found in one of Smith's storage lockers and the fragments of teeth buried beneath a house.
What's going on? He maintained photos of women and people he had known through the years, and for the most part we knew all of them, but there's one that's outstanding. We don't know who this person is. We don't know if she's a former girlfriend, former wife. We don't know if she's alive or if she's dead.
On July 18th, 2001, John David Smith was convicted for the murder of Janice Hartman. He was sentenced to 15 years to life. If charged in New Jersey with the murder of Fran Smith, he will be eligible for the death penalty. Her case is still open. Her whereabouts remain unknown. After more than 25 years, Janice Hartman was finally laid to rest in Ohio. The family of Fran Gladden Smith hopes they won't have to wait that long. A victim often has no warning when a loved one turns predator and the game is murder. But with the aid of microscopes, computers, and dogged police work, investigators can bring to justice those loved to death. In North Carolina, the home of a prominent couple becomes an unlikely scene of terrible bloodshed. Across the country, a California woman vanishes, worrying her family, and the investigators trying to find her. In a violent crime's aftermath, a spray of blood is sometimes the only clue to what happened. When nobody's talking, investigators must decipher cryptic answers written in blood. Durham, North Carolina.
Durham 911, what is your emergency?
In the early morning hours of December 9th, 2001, a 911 operator at Durham Police Headquarters received a frantic call from a man named Michael Peterson.
Okay, what's wrong there, sir?
Peterson told her his wife had fallen down the stairs. She was unconscious, but still breathing.
And is she breathing, sir?
He pleaded with them to hurry. The operator dispatched an ambulance and patrol officers right away. The EMT crew arrived in minutes. In a second 911 call, Mr. Peterson had said his wife had stopped breathing. Inside, the EMTs found Michael Peterson distraught, standing over his wife. He said he found her like this. They moved him away so they could attend to her. She had lost a lot of blood. They found no pulse, no sign of breathing. Kathleen Peterson was dead. Crime scene technicians were called in. They were careful not to track anything into the area. The site of every unexpected death must be treated as a crime scene. The technicians photographed the body to document its placement and condition. They noticed a bloody footprint on the woman's calf. The technicians recorded every detail, since anything can become important later. When they were finished, they removed the body. Durham Police Sergeant Terry Wilkins worked the scene.
What I noticed was what appeared to be an unusually large amount of blood for someone to have fallen down the stairs. I've witnessed people that have had fall injuries, and I've never in 18 years of law enforcement experience seen that much blood from an accidental fall.
Michael Peterson explained what happened earlier that night.
There are a few things that we need.
He and Kathleen watched a movie and drank some wine. He thought she went to bed while he sat outside by the pool. When he came in, he found her at the bottom of the stairs. Though the death was called in as an accidental fall, Durham Police Homicide Detective Art Holland was assigned the case.
It's routine for us to respond to death investigations where there may be suspicions or possibly foul play involved.
Checked her out. She is in fact deceased. Unusual situation in that there's an extreme amount of blood in the stairway.
Sergeant Wilkins briefed the detective about what they knew so far.
She did have a large amount of blood on her person, on the bottom of her feet, on the floor, under, beside her, on the walls, on the steps. There was spatter on the walls that was very concerning.
Noticed blood spatters on the wall there.
Because of the amount of blood, Holland's instinct told him it was more than a simple accident. If so, they would have to prove it.
Our crime scene technicians started photographing, videotaping, measuring the scene, which is a very time-consuming process.
They noted the placement and condition of anything that might help explain what happened that night. The technicians found 2 wine glasses in the kitchen. This fit with Michael's story that he and Kathleen shared a bottle of wine. They also found traces of blood on the cabinet where other wine glasses were kept and documented it. The blood throughout the house might be the best clue as to what happened. The investigators wanted a specialist to process it all.
One of our forensic technicians contacted the State Bureau of Investigation and requested their assistance to come do a blood spatter interpretation.
While they waited for the blood spatter expert, the investigators continued the search of the house. If it turned out to be a homicide, the mundane could become critical. From Michael Peterson's desk, they confiscated files, email printouts, floppy disks, CDs, and his personal computer. Anything that might contain useful information. That afternoon, several hours into the processing, Special Agent Dwayne Deaver of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation arrived. Investigators hoped the blood spatter expert would be able to tell them if it was an accident or murder.
An accident is going to produce a certain type of stain. It's going to be of a certain height. It's going to be of a certain quantity. And so we would look at that first. Are those things present? Do they look that way? Hey, how you doing? What have you got?
Immediately, Deaver saw signs of trouble. Smaller drops of blood mean more force was used to spray them out. In this case, the drops were very small.
Those impacts had been very forceful, much more forceful, in my opinion, than would have occurred from a fall.
Deaver needed to establish where Kathleen was when she started to bleed. From the shape of the drops, he first determined the angle at which the blood hit the wall. He then used strings to mark the direction the blood traveled through space. The point where the strings intersected was where the impact occurred.
I found points of origin off the surface, out in space, and that was inconsistent to me with a fall.
There was something else.
I found a transfer stain on the step right above her, where her body had been, that showed that an object that, to me, had a hook on it had been placed on that step. Perhaps that was an object used to strike the victim.
As far as the blood evidence was concerned, someone killed Kathleen Peterson. At the medical examiner's office, Dr. Deborah Radish conducted an autopsy, finding 7 head wounds.
She had lacerations close to the top of her head, at the bottom of her head, near the top of her neck.
The doctor concluded Mrs. Peterson had been beaten multiple times with a cylindrical blunt object, light enough not to cause skull fractures.
It was my opinion that her death was not as a result of falling down the stairs, and in fact, if this woman had been found anywhere else except at the bottom of a flight of stairs, there would be no question in people's minds but that she had been beaten.
At Durham Police Headquarters, a task force formed. The Petersons were a prominent couple in the community, and police anticipated the media scrutiny would be intense. But that would not affect the professionals working the case.
My main concern was that the investigation was done appropriate and done right. As far as it being high profile, that didn't bother me, and I don't think it bothered other officers.
They believed Kathleen Peterson was killed. Michael Peterson was the prime suspect. But they did not want to make an arrest until they had a solid case. The Durham investigators were determined to solve the crime and bring the person responsible to justice. Kathleen Peterson and her grieving family deserved it. In December 2001, Durham, North Carolina authorities were trying to find the truth behind the death of Kathleen Peterson. Kathleen's husband, Michael Peterson, claimed he found her at the bottom of the stairs in their home. But police believed she was beaten to death. At the State Bureau of Investigation laboratory, forensics experts examined the evidence recovered from the Peterson house. Michael had said he and his wife shared a bottle of wine the evening before her death. Police had found 2 wine glasses on the kitchen counter. The examiner processed both glasses for fingerprints. Yet only one revealed latent prints. The other was clean. The examiner lifted the prints for comparison against those of the Petersons. Checking the prints from the wine glass against the set of prints taken from Kathleen's body, The examiner found no match. But when compared to Michael Peterson's fingerprints, they matched. Investigators wondered if Michael had staged the wine glasses on the counter after Kathleen was dead to support his story. Detective Art Holland recalled the state of one cabinet door in the kitchen.
And that cabinet door did have blood on it, which would make you think that, you know, why would there be blood on that cabinet if somebody didn't go in there after somebody was bleeding and get that glass and set it out?
Police suspected Kathleen's husband, Michael, was involved. If so, they needed to find a motive. They started with a phone records check. Detective Holland ran the check to try to determine when Kathleen last spoke with someone other than her husband.
We were able to determine that she was in fact alive at approximately 11 p.m. that night because she had made a phone call to a co-worker.
Police interviewed that co-worker to see if she could provide them with any additional information. The woman told police Kathleen called because she needed a document for a meeting the following day and asked the co-worker to email it to her. But since she was not at the office, Kathleen asked that it be sent to Michael's email address at home. Investigators wondered if Kathleen saw something else when she got the mail on her husband's computer. They sent the computer to analyst Todd Markley at CompuSleuth, a private forensic computer firm in Westerville, Ohio. Immediately, Markley saw that someone had erased many files from the hard drive the night of Kathleen's death. But that did not stop the analyst from finding those files.
The computer doesn't actually destroy anything. It puts it in to be recycled. And that information is easy to find on the hard drive if you know where to look.
Markley discovered a history of thousands of pornographic websites visited and hundreds of photographs downloaded. He also found sexually graphic emails between Michael Peterson and a prostitute.
Some of the emails were fairly explicit about what sorts of activities that they could do when they met up and how much it was going to cost.
Police wondered if Kathleen had stumbled across the emails that night and confronted Michael about them. Markley also found emails that indicated the Petersons were in financial trouble.
There were a fair number of emails that we discovered that talked about finances and money, asking friends for money.
Peterson had even tried to cash out one of Kathleen's life insurance policies so he could receive the money that had accrued. Authorities needed to know more about the Petersons' financial status. Officers visited Kathleen's place of work and spoke to the human resources director there. She told them Kathleen was a valued executive, but because of company-wide downsizing, she was on the possible layoff list.
We went there to get records, her employment records, life insurance records, to see if there was something in those records that would give Michael Peterson a reason to take her life. And we did find just that.
Kathleen had a life insurance policy that paid out $1.4 million if she died in an accident. It was a powerful financial motive. Yet, if Michael Peterson had killed his wife, police needed to know what kind of weapon he used.
You know, we searched that house from the attic to the basement. We did grid searches of the outside, try to locate any type of instrument that could have caused the blunt force trauma to Kathleen's head.
They found nothing that matched the hook-shaped bloodstain on the stairs. The investigation stalled. Police were becoming concerned that without the murder weapon, they might never solve this case. Then, the information they so desperately sought came to them. Kathleen's sister asked to talk with the detectives. She said the family had some information the police should know about. The sister told Detective Holland she had bought a distinctive fireplace tool called a blowpoke for everyone in the family years earlier. She had used the one at Kathleen's house just a few weeks before her sister's death to stoke a fire. But now, it was gone.
She had a blowpoke exactly like the one that she gave her sister Kathleen. And she wanted for me to see exactly what this instrument looked like and take it to the medical examiner's office to show it to the doctors there to see if it was possible that this type of instrument could have caused the trauma to Kathleen's head.
The medical examiner, Dr. Deborah Radish, had already determined that the wounds were caused by a cylindrical, blunt object.
And the blowpoke fit that description. What was interesting about the blowpoke was that it was not as heavy as, say, a regular fireplace poker. It had a thick brass wall, but it was hollow on the inside. And that could explain, in this particular case, why the lacerations of the scalp were so severe, but why she suffered no skull fractures.
Authorities knew they were getting close. But at the State Bureau of Investigation lab, Special Agent Dwayne Deaver and other experts still had work to do. They next examined the clothing the Petersons wore on the night Kathleen died. They wanted to know if bloodstain patterns on the clothing further supported their theory that Michael Peterson beat Kathleen to death. The team checked the shorts Michael had on when police arrived, looking for the distinctive spatter a beating would create.
When I looked at Michael Peterson's shorts, those impact spatters were there, in the crotch, on the inside of the leg of the pants, even having traveled and gotten on the inside of the pants first.
That is an indication that the person wearing the shorts was standing over a source of blood at the time that it was impacted.
They also wanted to compare the shoes to the bloody tread mark found on the back of Kathleen's pants. Using fingerprint powder and electrostatic contact sheets, they made a print of the bottom of the shoes. Comparing it to the mark on the pants, they found an exact match.
Now this indicates that she is face down. The blood spatters on the front of her pants indicate that she's face up.
She was beaten in several different positions over a period of time. At one time, she appeared to be on her hands and knees, at one time on her back, at one time in a crouched position as if she were trying to go up the stairwell.
It had been a prolonged attack, brutal and bloody, one that Michael Peterson denied ever happened, but one all the evidence pointed toward. Still, investigators needed to prove it in court. After the death of Kathleen Peterson in Durham, North Carolina, two very different stories emerged regarding the night of December 9th, 2001. Kathleen's husband, Michael Peterson, claimed that they had a normal night. Police were told the couple shared a bottle of wine and enjoyed a quiet, romantic evening like they had so many times before. Michael suggested to police perhaps Kathleen had more to drink than he thought, and that maybe she was drunk when she fell down the stairs. But only his prints were on the wine glasses. Durham authorities had a different version of what happened. They believed Michael Peterson brutally beat his wife to death with a fireplace blowpoke. At the State Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab, Special Agent Dwayne Deaver conducted a series of experiments using goat's blood to try to duplicate the blood spatter he found at the scene.
We went back and looked at falls, exaggerated falls from heights of 12 feet with a person who was already bloody for some reason. And we looked at those scenarios to see what kind of patterns would be produced and if they were comparable to the patterns that we saw on the walls. And we did not find any fall type actions that could produce the things that we saw in this particular case.
Then, Deaver tried to duplicate the blood spatter by mimicking a beating death. Dressed in clothes similar to those worn by Michael Peterson, he placed the goat's blood on a sponge, then struck it with a blowpoke. He found the action produced blood spatter very similar to the patterns found in the home and on the clothing.
Careful forensic analysis of the blood stains on the clothing, the walls, on everyone's clothing that was involved showed that this was not a fall, that in fact the individual had been beaten severely over a period of time in different positions and by the individual that told us that it was an accident.
During a 2-month trial in 2003, District Attorney Jim Hardin explained to a jury what the evidence showed happened that night.
It was very clear that he was attempting to engage in extramarital affairs. We presented a strong case that she found out about his attempt to engage in an extramarital relationship. I personally believe that she confronted him about it, and because of the conflict in the family revolving around Miss Peterson's jeopardy of losing her job, the financial situation that they had placed themselves in, I think that it was a trigger, it was a catalyst, and I think Mr. Peterson lost his temper and beat her to death and then attempted to cover it up.
Michael Peterson believed he stood to make $1.4 million from his wife's death. But what he received was life in prison.
The importance of the forensic evidence in this case cannot be overemphasized. Had it not been for the quick thinking of several of the folks at the scene initially to bring a blood spatter expert to that location while we had the house in our custody, I don't know that we would have gotten this result.
Careful blood stain analysis finally brought answers to the family of Kathleen Peterson. Across the country, another woman's family faced terrifying questions of their own. Lodi, California, a small city nestled in the San Joaquin Valley, south of Sacramento. Lodi sees fewer than 5 murders per year, so most citizens feel safe. But on December 17, 1990, Lodi resident Charles Abbott was growing concerned. He couldn't find his wife. A man had phoned him hours earlier saying he found Susan Abbott's purse. Charles retrieved the purse, then called friends and family members. No one had heard from Susan that day. Her sister wanted Charles to call police.
Lodi 911, what's your emergency?
The 911 operator took down the relevant information and dispatched a patrol officer to the Abbott house. The officer arrived just as Susan's sister was pulling up. Charles had asked her to come. He was worried about Susan. The close-knit family always stuck together. Charles said he called Susan's work. She had not shown up that morning.
Well, it's not like her.
The officer asked when Charles last saw his wife.
Dropped me off at work.
It was so great.
Charles explained it was around 8 o'clock that morning. His truck was in the shop for repairs, so Susan drove him to work. They left the house a little before 8. She dropped him off, and he assumed she continued on to the hospital where she worked. His truck would be ready that afternoon, so she did not plan to pick him up. Everything seemed fine when he last saw her. Charles said when he came home that afternoon, he got the call from the man who found Susan's purse.
And that's not like her.
He went to the man's house to pick it up. The man said he found it in a dumpster behind a local Mexican restaurant.
It's right here.
Susan's credit cards and a large amount of cash were missing. They had just sold a car, and Susan had $4,000 with her, which she was going to deposit that day. They could not think of a reason why Susan would want to leave. At the officer's request, Charles gave him a recent photo of Susan.
About 4 months ago.
He said that day she was actually wearing the same sweater as she was in the picture. By the next morning, there was still no word from Susan Abbott.
Hey, Bill.
And Detective Sergeant Bill Barry was assigned the case.
I just took this report from...
He knew it was possible Susan simply left.
Seems kind of hinky to me. That's why I want to talk to you
But
about
if
it.
so, he still had to find her to let her family know she was safe.
People do walk away from their lives. Sometimes there's a mental health issue, sometimes they are unhappy with their lives, sometimes there's something going on we don't know about. But what you hope for is that you're going to find them okay.
Sergeant Barry began a routine missing persons investigation.
We gather basic information about someone who's missing, their physical description, height, weight, date of birth, the car that the missing person may have been last seen in or was associated with. We immediately get a bulletin out to law enforcement agencies in the area, along with our officers who are on the street.
To follow up on the purse, an officer went to interview the man who reportedly found it. He confirmed that he found the purse in a restaurant's dumpster while he was salvaging cardboard.
Where's the liquid dumpsters?
There was no money and no credit cards inside. He saw Susan's ID and called to return it.
All black, yeah.
The officer took down the name of the restaurant where the dumpster was. The man had no criminal record, and a later search of his property yielded no clues. Police believed his story.
Okay.
The dumpster was impounded, and Sergeant Barry and other officers began showing the missing woman's photo around the strip mall near the Mexican restaurant.
Because of the circumstances, you are worried that some harm has come to this person. You want to do your best to try to locate them, get them recovered, get them back with people who love them.
Some clerks recognized Susan as a regular customer, but no one reported seeing her recently. The case grew more ominous with the next lead. Susan's van had been found in a parking lot several miles from the Abbott house.
On my way down there, I was hoping that what it would do is provide some indication as to what happened to her, something that would lead us to her. I didn't know what to anticipate, but I was at least hopeful that we might find something.
Looks like you got it, huh?
There was no sign of Susan Abbott. The van was parked and locked next to a bank near an ATM.
Anything unusual looking at this point? The bank was closed. There was no one around the vehicle. It was just parked normally as if somebody had parked it there and gone into the bank but just never came back.
Charles Abbott made the discovery along with two friends.
They told me that they had gone out driving around after making the initial report to the officer to try to locate Susan's car. Charles said he'd remembered that Susan had about $4,000 in cash that she was going to take to the bank that day, so he decided to go by the bank and see if her car was there.
The men said they had not touched the van.
The car was clean, sitting by itself, no disturbance to it. Looked like it had just come off a used car lot.
Barry prepared it to be towed to the police impound yard.
One thing that did stand out in the vehicle was 2 boxes of plastic trash bags in the back seat. One of them was opened. We didn't know what those connected to at that point.
And we thought that odd, given the general absence of any contents in the car.
It was possible someone had seen Susan with the cash and abducted her from the bank. Police hoped some evidence inside the vehicle would help explain what happened and tell them where Susan Abbott was so they could find her and bring her back to her family. On December 17, 1990, 35-year-old Susan Abbott was reportedly last seen dropping her husband off at work in Lodi, California. That afternoon, a man found her empty purse in a dumpster. And the next day, her husband discovered her van abandoned near a bank. Recovering the purse and vehicle was a bad sign for Detective Sergeant Bill Barry.
Under ordinary circumstances, someone just doesn't throw their purse away in a garbage dumpster, doesn't just leave their car parked at a bank and walk away from those things. It's possible, but it's unlikely. And at that point, we were concerned that Susan may be the victim of foul play.
Investigators went back to the Abbott house. They needed more information from Charles.
Hi, Mr. Abbott. Yes. Hi, Detective Barry. Remember me from last
Perhaps there were answers in the details of Susan's last known actions.
someplace where we can sit
Charles told the detective about the money Susan had with her. But Charles said the last time he saw her was when she dropped him off at work. He did not think anyone else knew about the money and could not think of anyone who would want to harm Susan.
He said he wanted to take it for a test drive.
Then, 2 days after Susan Abbott disappeared, investigators' fears came true.
Sergeant Barry.
On December 19th, Sergeant Barry received a call from the San Joaquin Sheriff's Department. Someone had found a body.
ATA is about 30 minutes.
Lodi detectives responded to a railroad trestle in rural San Joaquin County, 20 miles outside of Lodi. The initial clothing description matched what Susan was wearing.
When we arrived here, we were briefed by the detectives from the San Joaquin County Sheriff's Department. They had taken photographs of her face. We compared those to the photograph that had been given us by Charles, and it was obvious that this was one and the same person.
A man dumping some tires had found her. He had not seen anyone around. With no witnesses, they had to read the scene for clues.
The victim, Susan Abbott, was laying on her back at the bottom of this railroad trestle. Her arms were folded up slightly, her legs were slightly bent, so it indicated to us she'd been in a confined space when she went into rigor.
She had a head injury that appeared to be a gunshot wound, but there was little blood, itself a clue for Lodi homicide detective Stephen Price.
Considering her injury, the clothing was very clean. Her body and facial area appeared to be very clean. If she had been murdered at this scene, there would have been a lot of blood that would have been consistent with the type of injury. There's very little blood in the area, so it would indicate to me that the murder occurred somewhere else. We began doing a thorough grid-type search, looking for any evidence that might be present in the area, not just at the body, the location of the victim, but also on the ingress or exit routes.
There were no discernible footprints or tire tracks.
We found no indications of a struggle, no shell casings, no other evidence at the scene. She'd been carried out there carefully and placed on the ground.
The body was removed for autopsy.
We knew that it would have been very difficult for someone to have placed Susan's body in its location by themselves. Carrying her to that location, putting her down, would have been difficult for one person. Also, somebody had to drop Susan's vehicle off outside the bank. And we knew that these things indicated that there was a likelihood of a second individual.
The investigation shifted immediately.
Once you know you have a murder, obviously the investigation kicks up into high gear. We put all of the resources that we had available into working this case. It's very critical in the first few days of a murder case that you work all the available leads.
Police needed to do a more thorough interview with Charles, routine for a murder investigation.
Her husband is a natural suspect. The person who last saw her is a natural suspect. In this case, they were the same person, Charles Abbott. You need to ask questions about whether there has been domestic disturbances. Had they argued recently? Were there disagreements about money? Things that might play into a motivation for murder.
Charles said he and Susan had been getting along fine. no financial trouble, no marital problems. The detective asked about weapons, and Charles said he had 2 rifles and a .22 caliber pistol.
We talked to Charles about what his activities were the day Susan went missing.
They needed to create a minute-by-minute timeline.
She had dropped him off at the storage unit where he operated his electrician business. He went into his storage unit, arranged some materials that he was going to use during the day, and then walked to an auto body shop where his truck was being repaired.
He learned his truck would not be ready for several hours.
He rented a car, and then he went about doing some of his jobs. Then ultimately he brought the rental car back to the rental car company, dropped it off, and was taken back over to the auto body shop where he picked up his truck. From there he went home.
The detectives noted the time and place of each step. While the interview continued, the autopsy began. Pathologist Bill Maduros led the post-mortem examination. He determined the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. The doctor noted something odd. There was almost no blood left in the body, yet her clothing was clean.
So I suspect that she wasn't wearing this clothing when she was shot.
Her skin was clean, too.
Not only was she redressed, but probably washed and cleaned up.
This was very unusual for a murder. Checking the skin around the entrance wound, the pathologist determined it had been an execution.
I'm not an expert on guns, but I can safely say it was larger than a .22.
Investigators believe the murder weapon was a .357 or .38 caliber handgun. But no evidence suggested who fired it. While the autopsy was being conducted, police continued to look at Charles Abbott. Sergeant Barry ran a records check on him. There was no criminal record. He had several guns registered to him, the rifles and .22 caliber pistol he had mentioned, but there was another, a .357 Magnum.
We talked to him about weapons. He omitted any mention of a .357 revolver.
Investigators believe the murder weapon might have been a .357.
Hey, Bill.
Suspicion was settling over Charles Abbott. Then, another ominous lead.
About 3 days into the investigation, a call came into our dispatch center. The caller told our dispatcher anonymously that Charles Abbott had solicited someone to have his wife killed. The caller gave a couple of different names.
But each man named was incarcerated at the time of the murder. If Charles Abbott had tried to hire them, he was unsuccessful. Perhaps he found someone else to help him, or he did the job himself. After the December 1990 murder of Susan Abbott in Lodi, California, suspicion focused on her husband, Charles. The suspect had given Detective Sergeant Bill Barry a detailed account of his actions on the day Susan disappeared. It included going to the storage unit where he kept work equipment and renting a car for the day. Barry secured the records of the electronic card key system at the storage unit.
It had in fact logged his partner who had come into the storage unit that morning and had left a few minutes later. But there was no record of Charles Abbott's card being used any time during that day.
Next, the detective wanted to check the route Charles said he drove that day in the car he rented.
We had gone over in some detail his movements during that day, and we had done that twice.
Barry had turn-by-turn directions.
A simple check on Charles's alibi was to drive the route with the rental car and to check that mileage from that route against what was on the rental agreement. We saw that that did not match up, that there was a substantial discrepancy between the two.
Charles Abbott's alibi was crumbling. But investigators needed hard evidence to prove he was involved in Susan's murder. Lodi police crime scene technicians carefully processed the dumpster where the victim's purse was found.
We ultimately found household trash, a toothpaste tube box, a top to a napkin box, items which didn't really fit what we would have expected to find.
What do we have here?
More significantly than that, we found bloody towels.
The technicians also recovered the box to a bar of soap and the top to a tissue box. Uncertain which of these items might prove important to the case, investigators marked everything and collected it for later study in the crime lab.
The towels that we found in the dumpster were stained with blood, and there was also hair adhering to them. An examination of the blood found it to be O positive, which was a match for Susan's blood type. And the hair was found to be, under microscopic examination, consistent with samples of Susan's hair.
Police finally had enough circumstantial evidence to get a warrant to search the Abbott house. If it was Susan's blood on the towels, they might have come from the house. The murder might have taken place there. Officers removed Charles Abbott from the house, standard procedure for a search. They placed him in protective custody so the scene could be completely processed.
We're going to have you stand by here until we conduct.
They were looking for blood, ballistics, the murder weapon, anything that would show where Susan was shot. In the bedroom, technicians discovered minute specks of blood. They were on a wall near the bed, almost invisible to the naked eye. The technicians knew that blood spatter that tiny meant it came from a high-velocity spray, often seen in gunshot cases. They also noticed something on the floor of the bedroom. A lead fragment, likely the jacket of a large caliber bullet.
Might have a jacket here. Yeah, that looks like it could be a large caliber too. I mean, that's quite a bit of jacket.
Yeah,
it looks like possibly a hollow point round.
Police believe a .357 was used to kill Susan. In the dresser, they discovered a wallet containing Susan Abbott's credit cards, cards that Charles said had been taken from her purse.
We'll do. All right, thanks.
In the bathroom, investigators found more incriminating evidence.
We found a number of towels in the house. We recognized the patterns as being similar to the ones that we had found in the dumpster. We went and got the towels from the dumpster and compared the two and found that they were an exact match.
In the trash, they recovered more of Susan's credit cards. Evidence technicians swabbed the drain of the bathtub. They discovered traces of human blood. Investigators knew the body had bled out before it was dumped, and the body's position had indicated it was in a confined space, like a bathtub. Investigators still hoped to find the murder weapon.
We obtained search warrants for Charles's storage unit because once we had searched the house, we still had not located the gun, and the storage unit was an obvious location where it might be. As we searched the storage unit, we came across a number of items that were very significant to us.
There was no gun, but officers did find a box of .357 caliber ammunition.
It was a box of 50, and there were 6 missing. We knew that the weapon that was likely used was a .357, so there was some potential that these rounds obviously were the ones that were used to load the weapon.
The investigators also discovered information on dating services, including correspondence with mail-order brides. They recalled Charles had said his marriage was a solid one.
When we found those materials, it indicated to us quite the opposite, that he was interested in pursuing relationships with other women.
Additionally, the officers found leaflets for get-rich-quick schemes and other documents that showed Charles Abbott was having financial difficulties.
And this, of course, played into the possible motivation that collecting life insurance might be a motive for him to commit this crime.
To strengthen their case, investigators wanted to try and match the top of the tissue box found in the dumpster to the tissue box taken from the Abbott house. Using a comparison microscope, a trained examiner like Donald Morian can see if the minute fibers match up side by side.
You have to examine it microscopically to look at the way the fibers of the actual box, the paper fibers, cross. You have to match those fibers up to generally say that this piece of top was a part of this box originally.
One shot killed Susan Abbott. Investigators wanted to know what kind of gun fired that shot. Forensic tests on the bullet fragments found in the bedroom were consistent with one fired from a .357 Magnum, a gun Charles Abbott owned but could not produce for police. Although police never found the murder weapon, they now believed they had enough evidence to prove Charles Abbott killed his wife. He was arrested and tried for murder. In June of 1992, District Attorney Thomas Testa presented the jury what the evidence showed happened on December 16, 1990.
The night Susan Abbott was murdered, from all the evidence, we believe Charles Abbott went behind her, put his gun to her head, and pulled the trigger and shot her through the head, a contact wound to the back of the head. He then took her body into the bathroom, into the bathtub, and let it bleed out in that bathtub. Put new clothes on the body, new red, bright, visible clothes. Took her body out and laid her body out, not under the railroad trestle where it would be hidden, but near the railroad trestle, but in an area where she would be visible in that bright red outfit, because he wanted her to be found. She had to be found in order for him later to collect the insurance.
Charles Abbott was charged and convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison.
That's going to look like
when a killer's deceit masks the crime, police must turn to forensic experts to decipher the truth, written in blood.